The ink is barely dry on the Treaty of Paris, and the new nation is already restless. It's 1783. The American Revolution is over. The colonies have won their freedom, and the country, barely even a fledgling republic, is a patchwork of states along the Atlantic coast. The winds of change are blowing, and yet the young United States faces an uncertain future. Independence was one thing, but survival as a nation is another challenge entirely. The future seems both full of possibility and teetering on the edge of chaos. Philadelphia, the city where independence was forged, is now the heart of a nascent government struggling to find its footing. The streets bustle with energy, full of revolutionaries, politicians, and farmers, but there's a growing unease. The Appalachian Mountains, once seen as a natural barrier between the colonies and the unknown, now loom like a challenge. What lies beyond those peaks? The British are gone, but their absence has left a power vacuum. The Spanish are still clinging to their holdings in the South, while Native American nations like the Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware control vast stretches of land. Their intricate trade networks far more organized and sophisticated than most Americans want to admit. These are not just wildlands. They are civilizations, with deep-rooted histories and knowledge of the land that stretches back centuries. Yet, to the land-hungry settlers, it's a vast blank canvas waiting to be filled. The frontier calls to them, promising freedom, opportunity, and reinvention. But what is the frontier, really? It isn't just a land of untouched beauty and boundless potential. It's a land filled with obstacles, both seen and unseen. The truth is, the promise of the frontier is as much a riddle as it is a dream. And there are those legends in the making who can't resist the puzzle. At this moment, the American frontier isn't a far-off place. It's a challenge to be met, a dare to push forward, beyond the safe confines of what is known. This new country, still young and fragile, is about to take its first steps westward. The story begins in Philadelphia in 1783, just after the Treaty of Paris is signed. The treaty, which officially ends the Revolutionary War and recognizes American independence, is only a beginning. Beyond the treaty lies a new challenge, the wilderness, where settlers see endless possibilities and Native American nations stand ready to defend their lands. Imagine yourself in Philadelphia at this time. The ink of the treaty is barely dry, and the city buzzes with excitement. But that excitement is laced with uncertainty. The nation is weak, unsure of itself, and far from cohesive. The streets of the city are alive with conversation, but the conversations are about land. Who controls it? Who owns it? And where does the young United States end? The answer to those questions lies in the wilderness that lies beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The territory beyond these mountains promises riches, land fertile enough to grow crops that could feed a new nation, forests to supply timber for homes and ships, rivers that could become trade highways, stretching across the heart of this new world. But what settlers will soon learn is that the land they covet isn't as empty as they think. The land is not for the taking. It's a battleground of cultures, where every inch of soil is contested and fought over. The frontier calls to settlers, a promise of rebirth. It's not just about land, it's about a chance to start over. In the East, society is rigid, confined by tradition, class, and the weight of the past. But out west, anything is possible. Here, a failed merchant could reinvent himself as a fur trapper. A runaway indentured servant could claim a patch of land and call himself a farmer. It's an intoxicating thought, this idea of reinvention. For those who are bold or desperate enough, there's a belief that the frontier offers a fresh start. But let's not get too romantic. The frontier isn't a pristine paradise. In fact, it's a place of struggle, danger, and a constant battle for survival. The wilderness is relentless. Picture yourself waking to the sound of wolves howling in the distance, the night air thick with tension. Imagine hacking your way through thick forests, where the trees themselves seem to fight back. The summers are humid, the heat clinging to your skin like a second layer. Winters are cruel, biting cold that freezes your very bones. Disease follows you everywhere. Malaria, dysentery, smallpox, these are your constant companions. The mosquitoes, which early explorers describe as monstrous, feel like they're taking more than their fair share of your blood. And then there's the wilderness itself. The land is both beautiful and unforgiving. The rivers, like the Ohio and Muskingum, are lifelines, but they're also deadly, capable of turning violent in an instant. The forests filled with towering oak trees may be full of potential, but they come with a cost. Felling a single tree could take an entire day. Clearing land for farming is backbreaking work, and you're faced with the constant battle of the elements. One settler in 1785 described a buffalo stampede that flattened his crops in a matter of hours, an unforgiving reminder that the frontier doesn't play by your rules. But despite all of this, settlers still come. The land beckons with its promise, the desire to claim a piece of the wilderness and turn it into something more than just land. That is the frontier's ultimate allure. And leading the way for many is a figure who has become a symbol of this pioneer spirit, Daniel Boone. Boone isn't the only one to venture west, but he is perhaps the most legendary. By the 1760s, he's already carved a path through the Cumberland Gap, a narrow pass in the Appalachian Mountains. The gap becomes the highway for thousands of settlers. Imagine Boone, rifle slung over his shoulder, walking through a world where danger waits at every turn. But it's not fear that drives him. It's a quiet, stubborn resolve that allows him to navigate the wilderness like few others. Yet Boone's story, as legendary as it is, has its darker side. Boone himself is no stranger to conflict. His early settlement efforts, particularly in Kentucky, come at the expense of Native American nations. The Cherokee and Shawnee, who have their own agreements with the colonial authorities, are not happy with this incursion. Boone's own daughter, Jemima, is kidnapped by a Shawnee and Cherokee raiding party in 1776, a stark reminder that the frontier is no one-sided adventure. Boone rescues his daughter because that's what legends do, but the event highlights an uncomfortable truth. The frontier isn't just a place of opportunity. It's a contested space where every step forward is marked by resistance, loss, and violence. This is where the story of the frontier begins. The promise of land, freedom, and reinvention is real, but the cost is high. It will be a price that both the settlers and the Native American nations will continue to pay for generations to come. The frontier isn't just a place, it's a crucible, one that will test the limits of ambition, endurance, and survival. And at this moment, just after the Revolutionary War, that crucible is waiting to be faced. The Ohio River Valley, a lush, fertile land that stretches across what are now the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and parts of Kentucky and West Virginia, becomes the first great battleground for the American frontier. It's a place where dreams and blood are interwoven, where settlers, explorers, and Native American tribes clash and create a new American identity. The Ohio River Valley is far more than just land. It's the key to the promise of the frontier, a land where agriculture, commerce, and a new way of life are born or destroyed. The valley's allure is undeniable. Its fertile soil seems to promise an endless bounty for those seeking to build their future. The rivers, most notably the Ohio River and the Muskingum River, offer pathways to trade and exploration with the promise of connecting settlers to distant markets. The thick forests brimming with game offer the potential for hunting and fur trading. It is a place of opportunity, yes, but it is also a place of peril. In 1783, the world looks very different to those in Philadelphia, and even more so to the settlers moving westward. To them, the Ohio River Valley represents the dream of a fresh start, a place to escape the remnants of the old world, of class, debt, and the hierarchy that governs the East. The land is a blank canvas, ready to be claimed by anyone brave enough to stake a claim. The settlers see it as a promise of a better life, a chance to reinvent themselves, but that promise comes with a price. The irony, however, is that the land is far from empty. It's teeming with life, a civilization that has been thriving for centuries. Native American nations like the Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware have lived in the Ohio Valley for generations, their cultures deeply connected to the land. The valley is a rich tapestry of villages, trade routes, and intricate networks of power. To the settlers, it might appear as a wilderness ready for the taking, but to the native nations this land is home, and they are determined to protect it. At this point, settlers begin to see the Ohio River Valley as the key to securing a place in America's future, but they fail to see it as anything but a resource to be mined. The Native American nations, led by chiefs like Blue Jacket, Little Turtle, and Blackfish, understand the stakes. They are not just defending land, they are defending their way of life, their culture, and their sovereignty. The Ohio River Valley is a crossroads for many nations, and the settlers' arrival threatens to upend a delicate balance of power. But settlers, driven by ambition and hope, come anyway. They believe in the myth of the frontier, where anyone can claim a piece of land and turn it into something valuable. The valley becomes the first real test of American expansionism, a place where ideals of opportunity meet the hard realities of resistance and survival. The land is no longer a peaceful frontier, but a place where civilizations meet head-on. For the settlers, the Ohio River Valley becomes both a promise and a battlefield. The appeal of the valley lies in the fertile soil, the abundant wildlife, and the proximity to major trade routes. But the challenges it presents are real. The settlers find themselves facing a landscape far more unforgiving than they imagined. They must battle disease, from malaria and smallpox to the relentless plague of mosquitoes. The humid summers of the Ohio Valley feel suffocating, while the freezing winters can bring even the hardiest settlers to their knees. In a journal from 1785, one settler recounts the violent force of a buffalo stampede that flattened his entire corn crop in a matter of hours. "The frontier seems to have a personal grudge against me," he writes bitterly, capturing the sense of frustration many settlers feel as they try to tame the land. Yet the buffalo are not just a nuisance. They are part of the larger ecosystem that the settlers are attempting to control. Native nations like the Shawnee and Miami depend on the buffalo for sustenance, clothing, and tools. When settlers begin hunting the buffalo for sport, they disrupt this delicate balance, inadvertently turning the wilderness against themselves. The valley itself becomes a paradox. It's rich and inviting, yes, but it's also unforgiving. The forests, with their towering oaks and thick underbrush, seem to resist human encroachment. Clearing land is backbreaking work. One settler reports that felling a single oak can take an entire day. And the stumps, once the trees have fallen, must be burned or dug out by hand, a laborious and unrelenting task. What is meant to be a new beginning becomes a continuous struggle, a reminder that the frontier does not give up its riches easily. The rivers that crisscross the valley, such as the Ohio and the Muskingum, become lifelines for travel and trade. But they are also treacherous. A single storm can turn the calmest river into a raging torrent, sweeping away flatboats and supplies. The water offers freedom, but it also carries danger. Settlers soon realize that while the rivers make it easier to transport goods, they also create new risks: flooding, capsizing, and even river piracy. As the settlers pour into the valley, tensions begin to rise. Skirmishes with Native American nations become more frequent. The first of these clashes occurs in 1786, when settlers moving into Kentucky are ambushed by Shawnee raiders, who retaliate against the loss of their land. The Shawnee are not passive victims. They are fierce and skilled warriors, with their own agendas and alliances, which complicate the settlers' plans. The settlers, seeing the land as theirs for the taking, often overlook the complex network of diplomacy and trade that the Native American nations have cultivated for centuries. The first major battle occurs at the Battle of the Wabash in 1791, where General Arthur St. Clair leads an American force into the Ohio Valley, hoping to subdue the native resistance once and for all. The result is one of the worst defeats in American military history, with nearly 600 American soldiers killed in an ambush by a confederation of Native American nations. The battle serves as a harsh lesson that the frontier is not easily won, and that the native nations are not passive players in this drama. It's here in the Ohio River Valley that the settlers begin to realize that the frontier is not a promise that can be fulfilled without cost. It is a land of opportunity, but also one of violence and loss. The Ohio River Valley becomes the stage for the collision of two worlds, one of settlers hungry for land, the other of Native American nations fighting to defend their homelands. At the same time, this collision will shape the future of the United States. The settlers see the Native American nations as obstacles, while the Native Americans see the settlers as invaders. The Ohio River Valley becomes the first major battleground in the American expansion to the west, a fight that will echo through the centuries to come. But despite the conflict, the valley continues to draw settlers. The promise of fertile land and the lure of a new life are too strong to resist. Each new wave of settlers brings them closer to the Native American nations who have lived here for centuries, and the clash between these two worlds will shape the destiny of the American frontier. The frontier is a place where survival is never guaranteed, where every day is a battle against the land, the elements, and sometimes even the people you're supposed to be building a future with. The Ohio River Valley is no exception. It's not just a place of promise, it's a place of relentless challenge where settlers face dangers that can strike at any moment. The land is harsh, unforgiving, and sometimes downright cruel, testing every fiber of the settlers' resolve. And it's not just the wilderness they're up against. Their biggest challenge is often themselves. Imagine living in a cabin that's barely larger than a single room. A roof made of bark and logs, walls so thin that you can hear the wind howl through the cracks. Our typical frontier cabin measures about 15 feet by 20 feet, a tight space for a family of 6 or more. You wake up before dawn, the fire in the hearth still smoldering from the night before, and the only warmth in the house comes from the cooking pot hanging above the flame. You shovel snow out of the doorframe to get outside, but even then there's no guarantee you won't be facing down a pack of wolves or a hungry bear. The wildlife that roams the forests and plains may offer food, but it also offers danger. Life on the frontier is about constant improvisation. You might wake up to find a bear has knocked over your food stores, or that your livestock has wandered off, lost to the thick underbrush of the Ohio Valley. There are no stores to go to, no phones to call for help. Every settler is their own resourceful first responder. In fact, for the women of the frontier, survival goes beyond the daily tasks of cooking and cleaning. They become midwives, nurses, and, when necessary, defenders. One remarkable example is Ann Wilson, a woman who, when her Kentucky settlement is attacked by a Shawnee raiding party in 1786, grabs a rifle and holds off the attackers long enough for help to arrive. She wasn't unique. Women on the frontier were often just as capable as the men in defending their homes and families. Frontier women learned how to load muskets, treat injuries with herbal remedies, and barter with Native American traders. But for every Ann Wilson, there are countless others whose names remain unknown, their stories lost to time. The day-to-day survival for many settlers is a grueling test of endurance. The Ohio Valley may be fertile, but clearing that land for farming is an enormous task. One settler's journal describes how it took him an entire day to fell just a single oak tree, and once it was down, the stump had to be burned out or dug up by hand. Clearing a small patch of land could take weeks of backbreaking work. The soil might be rich and capable of sustaining crops, but the labor involved in taming it makes the promise of that land feel more distant with each passing day. And then there's the weather. The Ohio Valley's summers are hot, humid, and stifling, and the winters bring bone-chilling cold that seeps into the very walls of your cabin. The wind cuts through everything, and the snow can pile up so high that you have to mark the roof of your cabin with poles just to find it again. There are nights when the cold is so intense, the ground freezes so deeply, that the earth feels as if it's pushing back against you. Settlers who hadn't prepared for this harsh environment would find themselves in a constant state of discomfort, battling the cold with whatever makeshift methods they could find. In 1785, one settler wrote about boiled nettles being the only food he could survive on for an entire week, an extreme but not an uncommon fate. Yet, it's not just the weather that turns the land against the settlers. The mosquitoes of the Ohio River Valley were legendary in their size and ferocity. Early explorers described the insects as being so large they seemed to have the strength of birds, swarming in thick clouds that would devour a man's blood in minutes. But the mosquitoes didn't just bring discomfort. They brought disease. Malaria and dysentery were constant threats, as was smallpox, which could wipe out entire settlements in a matter of days. These diseases didn't discriminate between settler and Native American. They were the great equalizer on the frontier. In addition to the natural challenges, settlers had to contend with the Native American nations whose lands they were encroaching upon. The Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware are not mere passive residents of the valley. They are fiercely protective of their territory and way of life. Their villages are centers of trade and diplomacy, connecting not only their own people, but also the Iroquois Confederacy and other tribes across the region. The settlers may see their land as empty and untamed, but the Native American nations understand the land's value in a way the settlers could never truly comprehend. The reality of settler-native interactions is complex. There's a prevailing myth of the noble savage versus the settler, but the truth is far murkier. While settlers see Native Americans as an obstacle to their expansion, Native American tribes are simply trying to defend their sovereignty. These tribes are not only protecting their land, they are fighting to preserve their culture, their way of life. The Shawnee and Miami are not aggressors. They are responding to the settlers' continuous encroachment. The settlers are just as often aggressive, pushing deeper into lands that have long been held by indigenous peoples. Tensions rise, and skirmishes between settlers and Native American forces become common. Settlers also face other dangers. The rivers that should be a blessing for trade and transport become a source of anxiety. A settler's journal from 1785 describes a flatboat loaded with supplies being swept away by the Ohio River's fierce currents, leaving the family stranded with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The waterways are both a source of life and a deadly threat. And then there are the animals. The forests teem with predators: bears, mountain lions, and wolves. One settler recounts an encounter with a black bear that raided their food supplies, forcing them to put up makeshift defenses. The animals, once seen as a potential resource for hunting, become yet another danger to contend with in the wilderness. Yet, amidst all the hardship, there's a strange sense of community among the settlers. They might live in isolation, cut off from the established order of the East, but they are not truly alone. There's a kind of rugged camaraderie that springs up among the settlers, born from their mutual reliance on one another. Barn raisings, for instance, become a central social event. In these gatherings, settlers work together to build a cabin in a single day, sharing not only their labor, but also their stories, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. The process of building a home together brings settlers closer, even if it's just for a short time. But there's also a deeper, darker side to this existence. Malaria and smallpox continue to ravage the frontier, wiping out entire settlements and leaving grief-stricken survivors to deal with their loss in isolation. Frontier life is full of both joy and sorrow. The same settlers who find themselves singing around the fire at a barn raising may also find themselves digging graves for loved ones who fell to disease or violence. The loss is as constant as the struggle itself, a reminder that the frontier is no romantic Eden, but a land forged in hardship, loss, and survival. The settlers may not have realized it when they first set out for the frontier, but they are now part of a much larger story, one that will stretch across the entire continent. The Ohio River Valley represents a starting point, a place where the American ideal of manifest destiny is put to the test, where the land itself becomes a battleground for cultural survival, identity, and the eternal struggle for land and freedom. Each decision made by the settlers, from the clearing of forests to the expansion of farms, shapes not just their immediate future, but the future of an entire nation. The tension between settlers and Native American nations intensifies as settlers continue to pour into the Ohio River Valley and beyond, turning what was once the frontier into a battleground. For the settlers, the drive for land, opportunity, and a fresh start remains as potent as ever. But the costs are mounting, and they are now facing an enemy far more formidable than the wild animals, disease, or even the land itself, the native nations. As the 1780s give way to the 1790s, the land that settlers see as untamed wilderness becomes increasingly contested territory. The Ohio River Valley is the first real flashpoint in the struggle for control of the frontier, and the native nations who call this land home are unwilling to let it slip away without a fight. The Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, and other tribes have long held this land, and they are not about to relinquish it without a struggle. At the heart of the native resistance stands Little Turtle, the leader of the Miami, and Blue Jacket, a Shawnee war chief. These leaders unite several of the most powerful native nations in the region to form a loose confederacy, the Western Confederacy, aimed at pushing back against the settlers and their encroachment on the land. But the settlers, driven by their own ambitions and the government's support, continue to move westward. The new American government, still in its infancy and struggling to assert control, tries to establish its authority over the frontier, but its efforts are met with failure. In 1791, General Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory, leads an army of 1,400 men into the Ohio River Valley, hoping to squash native resistance and pave the way for further settlement. But the natives, under the leadership of Little Turtle, ambush the American forces near the Wabash River in what becomes one of the worst defeats the United States military will suffer in its early history. Nearly 600 men are killed in the battle, and St. Clair's defeat shakes the government's confidence in its ability to control the frontier. This loss is not just a military setback. It is a stark reminder of the power of the Native American nations and the consequences of ignoring their sovereignty. For the settlers, this is an eye-opening moment, a brutal reality check. The land they want to settle on is not an empty canvas. It is already home to nations with their own deep histories, cultures, and claims to the land. The settlers, once so confident in their sense of entitlement, are now faced with the harsh truth that their conquest of the frontier will not be easy. But the government does not retreat in the face of defeat. President George Washington, recognizing that the frontier must be secured for the nation's future, sends General Anthony Wayne, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, to restore order and punish the native resistance. Wayne is a man of iron resolve, and he spends the next 2 years training and preparing his forces, known as the Legion of the United States, to be more disciplined and capable than the force that suffered defeat under St. Clair. In 1794, Wayne's army faces off against the Western Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near modern-day Toledo, Ohio. This time, the Americans are better prepared, with superior training, supplies, and coordination. The battle is decisive, and Wayne's forces emerge victorious. The native coalition, fractured and weakened by the defeat, is forced to negotiate. The result is the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which forces the Shawnee, Miami, and other tribes to cede much of what is now Ohio to the United States. The Treaty of Greenville represents a significant victory for the United States and marks the beginning of an unrelenting wave of American expansion westward. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which had promised orderly settlement and even banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, begins to take effect. The land is parceled out, and the settlers, eager to claim their share, begin to pour into the newly opened territory. But the settlers do not see the full cost of this victory. For the native nations, the Treaty of Greenville represents a deep betrayal, a forced surrender of their lands, and a loss of their independence. The agreement is a painful reminder that their sovereignty is being eroded, and their way of life is in jeopardy. The Shawnee chief Tecumseh, who has witnessed the destruction of his people's land and the spread of settlers across it, begins to rise as one of the most powerful and charismatic leaders of native resistance. Tecumseh, a skilled diplomat and warrior, begins to organize a pan-Indian resistance movement, one that aims to unite the tribes against the encroaching settlers. He dreams of an alliance that would stretch from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, a united front that could challenge the American government's expansionist ambitions. His message is clear: the land must be protected, the future of native nations must be secured, and the settlers must be driven out. Tecumseh's movement is built on a vision of unity, a vision that rejects the encroaching influence of American settlers and resists the idea of surrendering to American control. But his movement faces a difficult task. The tribes are not unified, and many have different interests and allegiances. Despite this, Tecumseh continues to rally native nations across the frontier, believing that together they can stand against the American tide of expansion. But the American government is equally resolute. In 1811, Tecumseh's efforts to unite the tribes reach a critical point when Governor William Henry Harrison of the Indiana Territory decides to take action. Harrison, determined to curb Tecumseh's growing influence, leads an army to Prophetstown, Tecumseh's headquarters on the Tippecanoe River. The result is the Battle of Tippecanoe, a bloody conflict that ends in Harrison's victory. Tecumseh is forced to retreat, but his dream of a united native resistance does not die. His brother, the Prophet, is captured and humiliated, but Tecumseh's resolve only strengthens. The battle also marks a turning point in the conflict. Tecumseh's dream of a pan-Indian alliance begins to crumble, but the resistance to American expansion continues, and the frontier is now an active war zone. The settlers may have claimed victory in battle, but the land they are fighting for is a land that will never be entirely theirs. The Native American nations, despite their setbacks, are determined to hold on to their land, their culture, and their future. As the 19th century begins, the frontier is no longer just a place of possibility. It is a place of conflict, resistance, and determination. The settlers, spurred by their dreams of a new life, continue to push westward, but they do so with the full knowledge that every step is contested. The struggle for the Ohio River Valley is only the beginning, and as the frontier expands, so too does the war between the settler and the native nations. As the 1790s give way to the new century, the frontier continues to beckon with its promise of opportunity, freedom, and wealth. The United States, having barely secured its independence, now faces a more complex challenge, the struggle to define its identity and secure its borders. The country's westward expansion, fueled by the dreams of settlers, enters a new chapter, but it will soon encounter the raw and undeniable force of nature itself, the very land that so many have come to conquer. The idea of the American frontier as a land of endless promise is quickly tested by the unyielding reality of the wilderness. The rivers, mountains, and forests that were once seen as pathways to prosperity become insurmountable obstacles, the very land itself pushing back against the settlers' ambitions. It's a harsh reminder that this land, though vast, cares not for the taking. It's a battleground, where every inch of soil is earned at a tremendous cost. By the early 1800s, the Ohio River Valley is filling up with settlers. Land speculation is rife, and the government, eager to encourage growth and expansion, promises cheap land to those who are willing to tame it. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 has provided a framework for orderly settlement, creating the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The promise of land, free from the rigid class structures of the East, draws thousands of men and women eager to stake their claim on a new life. It seems like the frontier is wide open, ready to be shaped into a model of prosperity and order. Yet, as more settlers flood into the region, the Native American nations continue to stand in the way of this vision. They are not defeated, not by a long shot. The land is still theirs, and their warriors, led by figures like Tecumseh, are not just defending territory, they are defending a way of life. The Western Confederacy is still a force to be reckoned with, and the resistance grows more determined as more settlers encroach upon their lands. But the settlers have another ally, the U.S. government, which is more determined than ever to extend its control over the frontier. By now, the American army, though still young and inexperienced, is actively engaged in efforts to suppress native resistance and open up the land to settlers. It's a time of military expeditions, land surveys, and the establishment of forts and outposts across the frontier. The United States government sees the frontier not just as land to settle, but as the future of the nation. Expansion is no longer just a dream, it is policy. However, the settlers are quickly learning that this dream comes with a hefty price tag. The rivers that once seemed like highways for trade and exploration have proven themselves unpredictable. The Ohio River, in particular, which was meant to be a reliable route for travel, becomes an enemy. Settlers are confronted by floods, treacherous currents, and dangerous storms that turn their boats into floating coffins. Flatboats, once the symbol of frontier progress, are now seen as precarious vessels that can be upended by a single gust of wind. On land, the settlers are no less frustrated. The dense forests of the Ohio Valley, once so inviting, now feel like an endless maze of trees that fight back against any attempt to clear the land. A single oak might take an entire day to fell, and once the tree is down, the stump becomes another insurmountable obstacle. The settlers might think they've conquered a plot of land, only to find that nature itself is determined to win this contest of wills. Then there's the matter of disease. The Ohio River Valley is a hotbed for malaria and dysentery, diseases that hit the settlers hard, with entire families falling ill or dying. The diseases, carried by the mosquitoes that infest the wetlands, do not discriminate between settler and Native American. The settlers' inability to deal with these diseases, coupled with the constant stress of clearing land, building homes, and raising crops, means that survival is never a sure thing. Despite these challenges, the settlers are undeterred. They are driven by a singular belief that this land is their inheritance. Daniel Boone, the legendary frontiersman who helped blaze a path through the Appalachian Mountains and into the heart of Kentucky, becomes the figurehead for this movement. Boone's story is one of stubborn persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. He knows the wilderness is harsh. He knows the risks, but he also understands that the rewards of perseverance are worth the cost. Yet Boone's journey is not without complications. His work in Kentucky, establishing settlements like Boonesborough, is instrumental in opening up the frontier, but his ventures are not without resistance. The Cherokee and Shawnee are far from passive in the face of Boone's settlements. They are deeply attached to their land, and they are not ready to let it go. Boone's own family pays the price for this land grab. His daughter, Jemima Boone, is kidnapped by a Shawnee and Cherokee raiding party in 1776. Boone's heroism in rescuing his daughter becomes a symbol of the pioneer spirit, but it also underscores the cost of expansion. The frontier is not just a land of opportunity, it is a land of violence and loss, where every victory is shadowed by resistance, bloodshed, and heartache. And yet, the settlers keep coming. By the time we reach the early 1800s, the frontier is alive with activity. The Cumberland Gap, which Boone helped make famous, is now a major route for settlers moving west. It is a narrow pass through the Appalachian Mountains, but it becomes the gateway to the west. The first step on the journey that will lead thousands of families to claim land in Kentucky, Tennessee, and beyond. The Ohio River Valley is no longer just a remote frontier. It is an emerging center of trade and agriculture, where towns and settlements sprout along the rivers, and the land begins to take shape. The settlers, though still facing hardship, are beginning to build lives and communities. The frontier is no longer just an empty wilderness. It is becoming an incubator for the future of the United States. But with this growth comes conflict. The settlers, now more entrenched in the Ohio Valley, clash with Native American tribes in more frequent skirmishes. The Shawnee, Miami, and other tribes are forced to fight for their survival, and the American government responds with increasing military pressure. The Indian Removal Act, which will come later in the century, is just one of many policies that seek to clear the land for settlers. But the resistance is not over yet. As the settlers grow bolder and the government's grip on the frontier tightens, it is clear that the confrontation between settlers and native nations will not be easily resolved. And then there is the land itself, which remains as much a challenge as it is a promise. The soil of the Ohio River Valley is fertile, but the settlers must work hard to coax it into submission. The rivers, which were once thought to be highways to prosperity, prove to be as dangerous as they are useful. The wildlife, buffalo, bears, panthers, becomes both a resource and a danger, as the settlers try to tame the land by hunting its creatures. But even as the settlers face these overwhelming challenges, there is an undeniable sense of hope that keeps them pushing forward. The idea of building a future, of creating something new out of the wilderness, drives them onward. The frontier may be hard, but it is still a land of promise, of endless possibilities, for those who are determined enough to survive it. As the 1800s unfold, the frontier expands westward, but a crucial part of the American economy begins to take root in the vast, untamed lands, the fur trade. This economic engine, which had long been a staple for the French and the British, becomes an even more vital force as settlers and explorers continue to push deeper into the wilderness. The fur trade not only fuels the American economy, but also shapes the very nature of frontier life, creating a unique blend of cultures, economies, and conflicts. The fur trade is both a blessing and a curse, bringing prosperity to some and devastation to others. It offers riches for those who can navigate its harsh realities, but at a tremendous cost, one that will echo through the history of the frontier. The explorers, traders, and trappers who make up this world are a diverse mix of people: French-Canadian voyageurs, British deserters, runaway slaves, native tribes, and European settlers, all vying for control over the land's most prized resources, fur-bearing animals, especially beavers, bison, and otters. The Rocky Mountains, the heart of the fur trade, are a sprawling wilderness of jagged peaks and sweeping valleys. The American Fur Company, founded by the ambitious John Jacob Astor, dominates the trade, setting up forts and outposts throughout the Rockies. However, the life of a fur trapper is hardly glamorous. These mountain men, often solitary figures, live in the wild for months on end, surviving on their wits, hunting skills, and the scant resources they can carry. Their existence is as hard as the land they navigate, but the rewards are immense, if they can survive long enough to collect them. The role of the mountain men is more than that of simple hunters. They are the lifeblood of the fur trade. Men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Hugh Glass venture into the Rockies, braving grizzly bears, hostile Native American tribes, and the ever-present threat of starvation. They are frontiersmen in the truest sense of the word, forging trails, mapping the land, and opening the door for later settlers. These men become legends, their stories larger than life, but they are also symbols of the hardships that the frontier demands of those who dare to enter it. Their lives are marked by danger, resilience, and above all, survival. But the mountain men are not lone wolves. They work in brigades, groups of trappers who band together to hunt, trade, and survive. The fur trade itself depends on a complex network of cooperation between trappers, traders, and Native Americans. The rendezvous system is central to this network. Every summer, hundreds of trappers gather in remote locations, places like the Green River in Wyoming, for the fur rendezvous. These gatherings are a chaotic mixture of trade, feasting, and socializing. Trappers swap their pelts for supplies, ammunition, and alcohol, and the mood can shift quickly from jovial camaraderie to violent brawls. The rendezvous is a microcosm of the frontier, full of energy, danger, and an overwhelming sense of possibility. The rendezvous system, however, also exemplifies the cultural collisions of the frontier. Native American tribes such as the Crow, Shoshone, and Nez Perce play a crucial role in the fur trade, acting as guides, translators, and intermediaries. These tribes, accustomed to living off the land and trading with other tribes, find themselves drawn into the world of European settlers and traders. The mountain men, many of whom marry into Native American families, forge alliances that are both personal and professional, creating kinship networks that ease the exchange of goods and resources. But this exchange is not always harmonious. The fur trade comes at a cost, particularly for the beavers whose pelts fuel the industry. By the 1830s, beaver populations are in sharp decline, and the environmental consequences are becoming increasingly apparent. The trappers, driven by greed and opportunity, are decimating ecosystems that rely on beavers to regulate water levels, create wetlands, and maintain the health of the environment. In their pursuit of fortune, the mountain men are inadvertently destroying the very land that sustains them. This environmental exploitation has far-reaching effects. As beaver populations dwindle, trappers begin to shift their focus to other fur-bearing animals, such as bison and otters, which further disrupt the ecosystems of the Rocky Mountains and the plains. The Plains Indians, whose economy and culture are intricately tied to the buffalo, face an existential threat as the fur trade accelerates the decimation of the bison. The destruction of their primary source of sustenance and tools is a devastating blow. And they begin to realize that the frontier is not simply a land of opportunity. It is a land of exploitation that will leave deep scars on the land, the animals, and the Native American way of life. For the Native American tribes, the fur trade is both a source of economic benefit and cultural clash. Many tribes, such as the Hurons and Ottawa, had long been involved in fur trading with the French and later the British. But with the rise of American fur companies like the American Fur Company, Native Americans find themselves caught between the interests of European traders and the encroaching settlers. These tribes often rely on the fur trade to provide goods like guns, ammunition, and metal tools, which are vital to their survival. However, they also see their lands and resources becoming increasingly scarce as settlers flood into the frontier. One of the most infamous aspects of the fur trade is the role of violence, both between the traders and native tribes and between different factions of traders themselves. As the fur trade becomes more profitable, the competition between companies intensifies. Companies like the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company in Canada and the American Fur Company in the United States engage in fierce rivalries that lead to bloody conflicts. Fur traders are often armed, and Native American groups, whose role in the trade is vital but limited, sometimes find themselves caught in the middle of these violent disputes. Even the mountain men themselves, despite their legendary status, are not immune to this violence. One of the most famous and harrowing tales from the fur trade era is that of Hugh Glass, a trapper who survives a brutal grizzly bear attack in 1823. Left for dead by his comrades, Glass crawls over 200 miles to reach civilization, driven by a relentless will to survive and seek revenge. His story becomes one of the defining myths of the American frontier, one that symbolizes the sheer brutality of the land and the human will to conquer it. Glass's story, while extraordinary, reflects the grim reality that the frontier is not a place for the weak. It is a world where survival often comes at the expense of human decency, where the pursuit of wealth leads men and women to lose their humanity. Yet, as with all things on the frontier, the fur trade begins to fade. By the mid-1800s, the beaver is nearly extinct in the Rocky Mountains, and the fur trade begins to wane. The rise of settlements and the development of railroads marks the end of the fur trade as the dominant economic force on the frontier. As the settlers continue to pour westward, the demand for beaver pelts is replaced by the demand for land, agriculture, and resources. The fur trade, once a thriving industry, becomes a ghost of the past, a casualty of progress and a symbol of the wilderness's slow death. But the legacy of the fur trade is undeniable. It opens the door for westward expansion, cultural exchange, and the rise of the mountain men as symbols of the rugged frontier spirit. The fur trade also accelerates the destruction of the Native American way of life and leads to widespread environmental damage. The trade, built on exploitation, forces a reckoning with the land itself, and the effects of this exploitation echo throughout the history of the American frontier. The end of the fur trade signifies the end of an era for the frontier. The mountain men, the very symbols of the wild, free spirit of the frontier, are gradually replaced by settlers and farmers who begin to cultivate the land in earnest. The once untamed wilderness of the Rockies becomes a grid of farms and settlements. The frontier, as it was once known, is vanishing. But even as this chapter ends, the spirit of the fur trade, the relentless pursuit of wealth, the exploration of new lands and the collisions between cultures continues to shape the future of America as it stretches further westward. As the fur trade fades into the past and the fur brigades of mountain men are replaced by settlers eager to tame the land, the American frontier enters a new phase. The 19th century brings an overwhelming wave of expansion that transforms the frontier from a lawless expanse into a rapidly developing land where new communities, economies, and industries emerge. But this new frontier, like the ones before it, is full of unforeseen dangers, clashes, and conflicts. The land's rugged beauty continues to draw people westward, yet the price of that pursuit only escalates. The Mississippi River becomes the lifeblood of the frontier's growth, a central artery through which settlers, goods, and dreams flow toward the unknown. As the Ohio Valley fills up with settlers, new frontiers rise. The fertile soil of the Mississippi River Valley, especially in places like Missouri and Illinois, becomes an essential area for agricultural expansion. The land is rich, and settlers flood into it, convinced that this is the next land of promise. But it is also a land of danger, where disease, wildlife, and harsh weather threaten the settlers' ambitions. Yet it's the westward expansion, driven by the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that captures the imagination of the nation. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which doubled the size of the United States overnight, is the initial spark of this belief. The United States is now a young nation with vast territories to claim, explore, and conquer. The journey of thousands of settlers begins with the promise of unlimited land and opportunity, but the reality is more complex and perilous than anyone expects. The Mississippi River not only serves as a key transportation route for settlers, but also becomes a contested space. As more settlers push westward, they encounter multiple powers that see the river as crucial for their economic survival. The Spanish control the Mississippi River's southern portion, and they exert significant control over trade and goods. In the upper Mississippi, the British still maintain forts along the Great Lakes, supporting Native American resistance to the American advance. The settlers are caught in the middle of this delicate geopolitical web, where they must navigate not only the natural hazards of the land, but also the international tensions between the United States, Spain, and Britain. It is in the early 1800s, amid this frenzy of expansion, that Indian resistance begins to change the character of the frontier. The Shawnee, under their dynamic leader Tecumseh, push back with increasing force. Tecumseh's vision of a united Native American resistance to American settlers grows stronger. His dream is not simply to stop the advance of settlers, but to reclaim the land for his people, and he seeks to forge a pan-Indian alliance. However, His movement faces opposition not only from settlers, but from native nations who have already made peace deals with the United States. As Tecumseh's resistance escalates, General William Henry Harrison, a military leader and future president, marches west to defeat the Native American Confederacy. In 1811, Harrison confronts Tecumseh at Tippecanoe in present-day Indiana. Although Harrison is victorious, Tecumseh's forces inflict a heavy toll on the American soldiers. This battle becomes a crucial turning point in the ongoing struggle for the frontier. Tecumseh, while temporarily defeated, continues his resistance by forging alliances with the British during the War of 1812, hoping their support will tip the balance in his favor. By now, the war between settlers and Native American nations becomes increasingly violent. The Battle of Tippecanoe may have marked the end of Tecumseh's unified native resistance in the Ohio River Valley, but it signals the start of a larger, ongoing conflict across the frontier. The warhawks of the United States, eager to extend American influence, see this as a vital opportunity to clear out Native American resistance and ensure settlers have open access to the western lands. In parallel with these struggles on the frontier, cultural changes also reshape the landscape. The frontier, once seen as an empty wilderness ripe for settlement, begins to take on a more complex identity. Settlers begin to form tight-knit communities, building small towns and villages along the rivers, the foothills, and in the Great Plains. These isolated communities begin to form a backbone of the new nation, but their existence is fraught with hardship, tension, and self-reliance. Daily life in these settlements is no easy feat. Houses are constructed from logs and mud, and even basic supplies, salt, tools, medicine, become the subject of constant negotiation and trade. The settlers' lives are far from glamorous, but they are driven by the possibility of a better life, away from the rigid class structures of the eastern United States. Women play a crucial role in these communities, not just in domestic tasks, but also as midwives, herbalists, and even defenders when skirmishes with Native American groups occur. But life on the frontier is a tenuous existence. The land is unpredictable. One settler's journal recounts the experience of a buffalo stampede, which destroys crops and livestock, leaving the settler to face the unforgiving wrath of the frontier. The weather is as much a threat as any enemy, with unpredictable storms, droughts, and freezing winters causing devastation for unprepared families. The land seems to fight back against the settlers, testing their resolve and their ability to endure. Yet, amid the chaos of the wilderness, the Mississippi River Valley begins to thrive, thanks to the settlers' determination and ability to adapt to the land. New roads, towns, and farms rise along the riverbanks. As more settlers pour into the Mississippi Valley, the government begins to organize the land into official territories and states. Illinois, Missouri, and other areas begin to form the political framework for what will soon be the American Midwest. But as the settlers establish a foothold in the Mississippi Valley, the frontier continues to expand toward new horizons. The discovery of gold in the West, particularly in places like California, marks the beginning of a new rush, and the once unsettled lands of the Great Plains soon begin to be viewed through a different lens. Now the land is seen not just as something to be tamed, but as an opportunity to capitalize on. Speculators, miners, and entrepreneurs flood the frontier in search of riches, while settlers continue their journey westward, now with the dream of not just land, but fortune. The frontier has changed once again. The days of isolated, rugged independence are fading, as new systems of transportation, commerce, and political control take hold. The Mississippi River, once the defining line between east and west, becomes just one of many routes that settlers can take. The Cumberland Gap, which Daniel Boone had once used to forge a path into Kentucky, has now been replaced by railroads and wagon trains that stretch farther and farther into the heart of the frontier. But as the country continues to stretch westward, the Native American nations who once controlled the land are increasingly pushed to the edges. The United States government and its settlers, focused on economic and territorial expansion, begin to formalize their claim over the land. As the native resistance weakens and gives way to a system of treaties and forced relocations, the native tribes, from the Cherokee to the Shawnee, are forced to cede their lands and endure relocation to reservations, a tragic chapter that marks the end of an era for the original inhabitants of the frontier. By the 1830s, the American frontier is no longer just a land of rugged wilderness and raw ambition. It is now a political battleground defined by powerful ideologies, territorial disputes, and complex geopolitics. As settlers and government officials push westward, the country's destiny seems more entwined with the frontier than ever before. The doctrine of manifest destiny emerges during this time, giving a philosophical and political justification for the relentless push to expand across the North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Manifest destiny is not just an abstract idea, but a driving force that shapes the national identity of the United States. It is the belief that the American people are not only entitled to the land that stretches from sea to sea, but that they are chosen to spread their way of life, their democracy, and their civilization to all corners of the continent. This idea, rooted in a sense of exceptionalism, encourages the federal government, settlers, and even the military to take decisive action to claim and civilize the West. The doctrine becomes the moral compass for a nation eager to build its future. But the rhetoric of manifest destiny is fraught with contradictions. The land that so many Americans are eager to settle is not empty. It is already inhabited by Native American nations who have lived on the land for centuries. The settlers are not encountering an uninhabited wilderness, but a thriving and complex world of native cultures, trade networks, and land management practices. As settlers flood into the Western territories, the country faces a crisis. Can the dream of manifest destiny be realized without confronting the rights and sovereignty of those who already call the land home? This tension is most evident in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. Jackson, a man deeply rooted in frontier ideals and political ambition, seeks to clear the land for American expansion by forcibly relocating Native American nations from the southeastern United States to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. The act becomes one of the most controversial and heart-wrenching chapters in American history, setting the stage for the infamous Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act is a tragic reflection of how the ideals of manifest destiny, while uplifting for settlers, are built on the displacement, violence, and exploitation of Native American peoples. Jackson's push to relocate the tribes is supported by many settlers, who view the removal as an opportunity to open up fertile land for agriculture and development. In a nation so focused on growth and progress, the lives of the Native American nations are treated as an obstacle to be overcome. While the United States government enforces the Indian Removal Act, the push westward continues in earnest. The Santa Fe Trail, stretching 900 miles from Missouri to New Mexico, becomes one of the most famous routes for trade and settlers looking to stake their claim in the southwestern territories. The trail is initially a route for trade, with merchants bringing goods like cloth tools and weapons to trade with the Mexicans in Santa Fe. But as the demand for land increases, the trail becomes a pathway for settlers eager to claim land in the newly acquired territories. The settlement of Texas is another key chapter in the expansion story. Texas, which had once been a Spanish colony, becomes part of the larger Mexican territory, following Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821. By the 1820s, Stephen F. Austin, a Missouri settler, is tasked with bringing American settlers to the region, which Mexico desperately needs to populate and defend against Native American attacks. Austin's successful venture of leading 300 families to Texas is the beginning of an even larger influx of American settlers, many of whom are Southerners seeking land for cotton farming and willing to bring slavery with them. Texas's influx of settlers eventually leads to tension with the Mexican government, which is uneasy about the presence of so many foreign settlers. The Mexican government, under the leadership of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, imposes strict laws such as banning slavery and demanding loyalty to Mexico's central government. But for the Texian settlers, these measures only fuel their desire for independence. Tensions escalate, and by 1835, Texas is in the midst of a full-scale rebellion against Mexican rule. This rebellion, known as the Texas Revolution, culminates in the Battle of the Alamo in early 1836. In this pivotal battle, a group of Texian rebels, including James Bowie, William B. Travis, and Davy Crockett, hold the Alamo against a much larger Mexican force. The battle ends in a massacre, with all the defenders killed. The fall of the Alamo becomes a rallying cry for the Texians, who, despite their losses, are determined to fight for their independence. Their victory at the Battle of San Jacinto later that year leads to the capture of Santa Ana and the declaration of Texas independence. Texas's brief stint as an independent republic is marked by instability, border disputes, and conflict with Native American tribes. But despite these issues, the Republic of Texas is recognized by the United States in 1837. The state of Texas, however, does not remain independent for long. In 1845, after a fierce political debate, the United States annexes Texas, sparking a series of events that will lead to the Mexican-American War. The annexation of Texas brings the United States into direct conflict with Mexico. Mexico, which still views Texas as part of its territory, is enraged by the annexation. The stage is set for war. President James K. Polk, an ardent believer in manifest destiny, is eager to expand the United States borders and seeks to acquire not only Texas, but also California and the Southwest. Polk's aggressive diplomacy, which includes sending General Zachary Taylor to patrol the disputed border along the Rio Grande, leads to a skirmish that escalates into full-scale war in 1846. The Mexican-American War proves to be a bloody and decisive conflict. It stretches from the battlefields of Texas to the streets of Mexico City, and includes key victories like the Battle of Buena Vista and the capture of Mexico City. The war, which ends in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, results in the United States gaining over 500,000 square miles of land, including California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and parts of Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. For the United States, this acquisition fulfills the dream of manifest destiny. The nation has stretched from coast to coast, but the victory comes with a heavy price. The war exacerbates tensions over slavery, as new territories are added to the Union, and the question of whether they will be free or slave states divides the nation. The Compromise of 1850, which seeks to address the status of slavery in these new territories, temporarily calms tensions, but it does little to solve the deeper conflicts over the institution of slavery, a matter that will continue to plague the nation. Even as the United States celebrates its victory in the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of the West, the question of how to govern these vast new lands, what to do about Native American tribes, and how to deal with the political implications of slavery will continue to shape the nation's future. The promise of unlimited opportunity that came with the expansion of the frontier is tempered by the brutal realities of conquest, war, and political conflict. By the late 19th century, the American frontier, once an untamed expanse of wilderness, is in its final stages of transformation. The land that once seemed boundless is now increasingly confined by railroad settlement and the relentless march of industrialization. The closing of the frontier is not merely a symbolic event. It marks the end of a way of life that has defined the American spirit and character. The ideals of manifest destiny have been realized, but at a tremendous cost. The Homestead Act of 1862 sets the stage for the final wave of settlers who will transform the plains into farms, towns, and cities. The act promises 160 acres of free land to anyone who is willing to work it for 5 years. This law, along with the expansion of the railroad system, leads to the rapid settlement of the Great Plains, the Dakotas, and much of the West. Yet, this promise of land comes with its own set of challenges, as the land is not empty, but rather filled with native cultures, wildlife, and ecosystems that are rapidly being altered or destroyed. The railroads play a pivotal role in the closing of the frontier. As rail lines stretch across the country, connecting the eastern cities with the new territories in the west, they bring both opportunity and destruction. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, is the pinnacle of American engineering and a key moment in the nation's history. The railroad connects the coasts, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and ideas. However, it also accelerates the destruction of Native American ways of life as it cuts through sacred land, fragments ecosystems, and brings in waves of settlers and military forces determined to secure the land. As settlers flood into the western territories, the once vast herds of bison, the cornerstone of Native American life on the plains, are decimated. The Buffalo Bill Cody-led hunts, fueled by the demand for hides, and the need to supply railroad crews with food become one of the most iconic and devastating aspects of frontier life. By the end of the century, the bison population is reduced from tens of millions to a mere few hundred. The Indian Wars, a series of brutal conflicts between the U.S. government, settlers, and Native American tribes, reached their peak in the late 1800s. The government's policy of Indian removal evolves into a more aggressive strategy of assimilation and militarization. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse deliver a stunning victory over General George Custer and his men, represents a high point for native resistance. However, it is also the beginning of the end for many Native American nations. The U.S. Army, enraged by the loss, intensifies its efforts to subdue the native tribes, and by the 1880s, most have been forcibly relocated to reservations. The Great Plains, once a land of nomadic hunters and agricultural communities, are transformed into farms and ranches. The Homestead Act, combined with the arrival of railroads, brings tens of thousands of settlers eager to stake their claim. The land is plowed under, native habitats are destroyed, and new towns and cities rise in the places where buffalo once roamed and Native American tribes once thrived. But even as the frontier closes, its influence continues to shape American identity. The idea of the frontiersman, a rugged, self-reliant individual who bravely faces the wilderness, becomes enshrined in American mythology. Stories of cowboys, outlaws, and lawmen fill the pages of dime novels, and the figure of the cowboy becomes an enduring symbol of American masculinity and adventure. In many ways, the cowboy myth oversimplifies the hardships and complexities of frontier life, but it also reflects the longing for freedom and the romanticism of the open land. Yet the cowboy era itself is coming to an end. By the 1880s, the expansion of barbed wire fencing and railroads marks the final transformation of the frontier. No longer are the plains open for free grazing. Instead, the land is parceled out and the open range gives way to closed farms and ranches. The cattle drives that were once a hallmark of frontier life are replaced by the modern ranching industry, and the myth of the cowboy begins to fade as new industries and technologies take hold. The closing of the frontier is also a reflection of a deeper cultural shift. As the United States moves toward the 20th century, its identity evolves from one shaped by wilderness and frontier exploration to one driven by industrialization, urbanization, and global influence. The frontier, once the embodiment of the American dream, becomes a land of nostalgia. The myths of the West are romanticized and preserved in literature, art, and film. But the reality of life on the frontier, marked by hardship, violence, and loss, fades from the national consciousness. The Census Bureau's declaration in 1890 that the frontier is closed marks the official end of the era that defined much of American history. But while the frontier may no longer be an open space waiting to be settled, its impact on the nation's psyche endures. The legacy of the frontier, its values of self-reliance, independence, and adventure, continues to shape the country's identity as it moves into the modern era. Even in the face of industrialization and urbanization, the frontier spirit remains an integral part of what it means to be American. The closing of the frontier also highlights the cost of expansion. The Native American tribes, once the stewards of the land, have been displaced, their cultures shattered, and their populations decimated. The bison, once a symbol of the plains, are nearly extinct. The environment of the Great Plains is forever altered by farming and ranching practices that turn the once fertile soil into a dust bowl in the decades to come. And the myth of the frontier, while enduring, conceals the realities of displacement, exploitation, and environmental destruction. Yet even in its closing stages, the frontier continues to offer a sense of possibility, a place where dreams are made and lost. For the settlers who took part in the final wave of expansion, the frontier was not just about land. It was about creating a new life, reinventing themselves and escaping the confines of the old world. The frontier was a test, one that demanded not only courage and determination, but also an acceptance of loss and sacrifice. As the frontier is closed, America is no longer just a nation in the process of becoming. It is a nation that has been shaped by its journey westward. The frontier has not only expanded the country's boundaries, but has transformed its soul, creating a nation of individuals who, even in the face of failure and adversity, believe in the power of opportunity, hard work, and perseverance.